Blood pooled on the Afghan dirt, thick and black in the moonlight. Chief Kessler was bleeding out, his customized Mark 13 sniper rifle abandoned in the dust. The extraction chopper was 20 minutes away, and 50 heavily armed insurgents were closing in. That was the moment the healer had to become the executioner. The Shuryak Valley in eastern Afghanistan was a place where silence was never a good thing. It was a rugged, unforgiving scar in the earth, flanked by jagged Hindu Kush peaks that seemed to claw at the night sky. To the men of SEAL Team 6's Gold Squadron, it was just another sandbox. But to Petty Officer First Class Serena Jenkins, it was the ultimate proving ground. Serena was a Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman, a Tier 1 medic. In a world dominated by bearded, barrel-chested door-kickers, she was the quiet anomaly. She carried the same 60 pounds of gear, humped the same brutal elevations, and bled the same red blood. But her primary weapon wasn't the M4 carbine slung across her chest. It was the heavily stocked medical bag strapped to her back. To the men of the platoon, she was Doc. She was the insurance policy. They loved her, they protected her, but they didn't look to her to win the gunfight. Operation Silent Anvil was supposed to be a surgical strike. Intelligence had pinpointed a high-value target, a ruthless munitions facilitator named Tariq, hiding out in a remote compound halfway up a terraced ridge. The insertion via MH-47 Chinook had been flawless, dropping them 3 miles out. They had ghosted through the alpine forests, their night vision goggles painting the world in a wash of phosphor green. Lieutenant Commander David Bickford took the point, his suppressed rifle leading the way. Behind him was Chief Petty Officer Thomas Kessler, the platoon's primary sniper and an absolute legend in the sniper community. Kessler was a man who spoke in wind calls and ballistic arcs. He was paired with his spotter, Petty Officer First Class Ryan Sullivan. Serena brought up the rear with Jason Cobb, the heavy weapons specialist carrying the Mk-48 machine gun. Eyes on the target compound, Bickford whispered over the encrypted comms, his voice a gravelly hum. Looks quiet. Too quiet. Serena knelt behind a rocky outcropping, her heart doing a familiar, steady snare drum rhythm against her ribs. She scanned the darkness, her medical mind already calculating extraction routes and triage zones just in case. She watched Kessler and Sullivan low crawl to a vantage point on a flanking ridge, setting up their overwatch position. Kessler deployed the bipod of his Mark 13 Mod 7, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. Through the optics, he had a god's eye view of the compound courtyard. "I have the courtyard, 2 sentries on the roof. No sign of the HVT." Kessler's voice crackled in Serena's earpiece. "Assault element, move up," Bickford ordered. They breached the outer wall with silenced wire cutters. The assault team flowed into the courtyard like water, but as Bickford kicked the main door, the heavy oak didn't give. It was barred from the outside. "Commander!" Kessler's voice sliced through the comms, suddenly tight, stripped of its usual calm. "Thermal is lighting up. The adjacent tree line. It's an ambush. They're coming out of spider holes. Dozens of them. Fall back." Before Bickford could issue the retreat order, the night tore open. A DSHK heavy machine gun roared from an elevated cave to their east, the green tracer rounds looking like laser beams as they chewed through the adobe walls of the compound. The sound was deafening, a physical force that punched the air out of their lungs. RPGs hissed through the dark, detonating against the rocks and showering the assault team in lethal shrapnel. "Contact right! Contact right!" Cobb bellowed, opening up with his Mk-48, a long, continuous burst of suppressive fire that briefly forced the enemy heads down. Up on the overwatch ridge, Kessler's rifle barked. Crack, a pause. Crack. With every shot, an insurgent dropped. He was working the bolt action with terrifying speed, trying to buy the assault element time to break contact and fall back to the rally point. "Doc, move your ass!" Sullivan yelled over the radio. Serena didn't hesitate. She scrambled up the steep, shale-covered slope toward the Overwatch position, knowing that if the assault team was pinned, the sniper team was their only lifeline. Bullets snapped the air around her head, a sound like a whip cracking inches from her ear. She dove behind the boulder where Kessler and Sullivan were nested. "They've got us boxed in," Sullivan yelled over the din, frantically trying to laze targets for Kessler. "Distance 600 yards. Wind is full value from the left." Crack. Kessler took another shooter down. "I need a mag, Sully." But before Sullivan could hand over the fresh magazine, a blinding flash illuminated the ridge. An RPG warhead slammed into the rock face just 3 feet above their heads. The concussive wave threw Serena backward. The world turned into a muted, ringing void. Dust and powdered rock choked the air. She blinked hard, tasting copper and dirt, her medical training instantly overriding the shock. "Kessler!" Sullivan's voice was a panicked scream, cutting through the ringing in her ears. Serena scrambled forward. The dust cleared just enough for her to see the nightmare. Chief Kessler was on his back, writhing. A piece of jagged shrapnel the size of a fist had torn through his right shoulder, pulverizing the collarbone and ripping a massive exit wound through his upper back. Arterial blood was pulsing out in rhythmic, terrifying arcs, instantly soaking his desert camis. "Doc, help him! Help him!" Sullivan fired his M4 blindly over the rock, trying to keep the enemy off them, but a 5.56mm carbine was utterly useless against a DSHK at 600 yards. Serena was already moving. "Cover me, Sully!" Serena shouted, ripping her trauma shears from her chest rig. She dropped to her knees beside the bleeding sniper. Kessler's face was already going pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. My arm," he gasped, his left hand grasping weakly at his shattered right shoulder. "I got you, Tommy. I got you. Look at me." Serena barked, her voice commanding, stripping away the panic. In seconds, she had his tactical vest sliced open. The wound was catastrophic, a subclavian artery bleed. A tourniquet wouldn't work here. It was too high up on the junctional zone. She reached into her kit and pulled out a roll of combat gauze, impregnated with a hemostatic agent. Without hesitation, she jammed her fingers directly into the bleeding cavity, packing the gauze deep into the wound against the severed artery. Kessler let out a muffled, agonizing scream. "Sorry, brother, I know," she said through gritted teeth, applying brutal, downward pressure with her body weight. "Sully, get on the horn. Where is our air support?" Sullivan was ducking as rounds chipped away the rock above them. "Fast movers are 20 mics out. We don't have 20 minutes, Doc. The assault team is pinned in the courtyard, and they're setting up another RPG team on the north ridge. If they get a shot down into that compound, Bickford and Cobb are dead." Serena risked a glance over the boulder. Down in the valley, she could see the muzzle flashes of Cobb's machine gun, completely surrounded. Up on the north ridge, about 800 yards away, she saw the thermal signatures through the spare spotting scope. 2 men. One loading a rocket-propelled grenade, aiming down at the trapped SEALs. "Take them out, Sully!" Serena yelled, her hand slick with Kessler's blood as she held pressure. "I can't!" Sullivan shouted back in frustration. "My M4 can't reach that far with any accuracy, and I'm no sniper. I don't know Tommy's dope or how to run the Mark 13. We're going to lose them, Doc." Serena looked down at Kessler. His bleeding had slowed to an ooze under her knee, which she had awkwardly pinned against his chest to maintain pressure while freeing her hands. She quickly slapped a chest seal over the exit wound to prevent a collapsed lung, securing it with tape. He was in shock, but he was stabilized. For now. She looked at the abandoned Mark 13 Mod 7 lying in the dirt. The SEALs didn't know her past. They didn't know that before she was Petty Officer Jenkins, the ace medic, she was Serena Jenkins from the bitter, wind-swept plains of Wyoming. They didn't know her father was a Marine Scout sniper who had spent her entire childhood teaching her how to read wind mirages on the prairie, how to control her heart rate, and how to put a .30 caliber bullet through a coyote's eye at 1,000 yards. She had hidden that part of herself because she wanted to save lives, not take them. But right now, saving lives required taking them. "Keep pressure on this wound," Serena ordered, grabbing Sullivan by the shoulder and dragging him down to Kessler. "Do not let up, or he dies. Do you understand me?" "Doc, what are you doing?" Sullivan asked, bewildered, pressing his hands over the bloody gauze. Serena didn't answer. She slid forward into the dirt, kicking her legs out behind her and pulling the heavy Mark 13 sniper rifle into her shoulder. She settled her cheek against the stock. The weapon was covered in Kessler's blood and Afghan dust, but the action was closed, and the Night Force scope was clear. "Doc, are you crazy? Get down!" Sullivan yelled over the gunfire. "You can't make that shot!" Serena drowned him out. She drowned out the deafening roar of the machine guns, the screams from the valley below, and the frantic chatter on the radio. She entered the bubble. She stared through the magnified optic. The reticle settled on the north ridge. 800 yards. She looked at the dust kicking up around the rocks. She watched the way the sparse brush was leaning. Wind is blowing left to right, about 8 miles per hour. Slight updraft from the valley floor, her mind calculated instantly, a dormant muscle memory snapping violently awake. She reached up with a blood-stained glove and dialed the elevation turret on the scope. Click, click, click. She adjusted the windage. Down below, the insurgent stepped up to the edge of the cliff, hoisting the RPG onto his shoulder, aiming directly down into the compound where Commander Bickford and the assault team were clustered. He had them dead to rights. Serena exhaled half her breath. The crosshairs floated perfectly over the center of the insurgent's chest. She squeezed the 2-stage trigger. Boom! The heavy recoil of the .300 Win Mag punched her shoulder. Through the scope, she rode the recoil, getting back on target just in time to see the pink mist explode in the moonlight. The insurgent collapsed backward, the live RPG firing wildly into the night sky, detonating harmlessly against a far mountain peak. Sullivan stopped breathing. He stared at the medic, his mouth hanging open. "What the—" "Spot for me, Sully," Serena commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm, completely devoid of adrenaline. She violently worked the bolt, ejecting the spent brass, which pinged off the rocks and chambered a fresh round. "Where's the DSHK?" Bearing 290. Distance 950 yards. Elevated cave," Sullivan stammered, abandoning his shock to peer through his binoculars. Serena swung the heavy barrel of the Mark 13 to the left. She found the cave. The heavy machine gun was spitting continuous fire down on the team. The gunner was partially obscured by sandbags, leaving only a 6-inch window of exposed head and shoulder. 950, Serena muttered to herself. Bullet drop is significant. Wind is shifting in the canyon. "You're not going to thread that needle, Doc," Sullivan whispered. "It's too far, and the angle—" "Quiet." Serena held her breath. She didn't dial the scope this time. There wasn't time. She used the mil dots on the reticle, holding over for elevation and holding left for the wind. The rhythm of her heart slowed. Between the beats, she pulled the trigger. Boom! A full second passed. The massive muzzle flash of the DSHK abruptly ceased. Through the optics, Sullivan saw the gunner slump over the weapon, motionless. "Good God!" Sullivan breathed. "Impact! Target neutralized!" Down in the valley, Commander Bickford's voice came over the radio, breathless and confused. "Kessler, great shooting, brother. The heavy gun is down. We are moving to the exfil point. Keep giving us cover." Serena didn't bother correcting him. She worked the bolt again. The valley was crawling with targets now, insurgents swarming like angry ants, trying to cut off the SEAL's retreat. For the next 12 minutes, Serena Jenkins became the angel of death. She moved the rifle with a fluid, mechanical precision that took years to master. She calculated spin drift, barometric pressure, and angle cosin in her head faster than a ballistic computer. Boom. An insurgent flanking the team dropped. Boom! Another one running across a rooftop crumpled. She ran the rifle dry, slamming a fresh 5-round magazine into the magwell without taking her eye off the scope. She was laying down a curtain of precision fire so devastating that the remaining enemy fighters began to break and run, believing they were under attack by an entire platoon of snipers. Beside her, Sullivan could only watch in stunned silence. The woman who, just 20 minutes ago, had been handing out ibuprofen and checking hydration levels was currently operating the most lethal weapon system on the battlefield with the cold, calculated efficiency of a Tier 1 operator. "Assault element is clear." Bickford's voice finally cracked over the radio, the sound of helicopter rotors thumping in the background. "Birds are inbound. Overwatch. Fall back to the LZ." Serena kept her eye in the scope for another 10 seconds, ensuring no one was pursuing them. Finally, she engaged the safety and lowered the weapon. The sudden silence on the ridge was deafening, broken only by the approaching thwack, thwack, thwack of the MH-47 Chinook. She turned to look at Sullivan, who was still holding pressure on Kessler's bandaged shoulder. Kessler was pale, unconscious, but still breathing. Serena wiped a smear of dirt and blood off her forehead, her face completely deadpan. "Pack his gear, Sully," she said, her voice dropping back into the authoritative tone of a medical professional. "We need to get him on that bird before his blood pressure tanks again." Sullivan just stared at her, then down at the smoking rifle, and then back at her. "Doc, who the hell are you?" The twin rotors of the MH-47 Chinook beat against the thin mountain air, a rhythmic thumping that rattled the teeth in Serena's skull. The ramp lowered, kicking up a storm of blinding, icy dust. Jason Cobb and Commander David Bickford dragged themselves aboard, their faces blackened with carbon and sweat, their uniforms torn. Serena and Sullivan hauled Chief Kessler over the ramp just as the loadmaster screamed for liftoff. The massive helicopter banked hard, diving into the valley to evade any lingering anti-aircraft fire, leaving the burning compound in the Shuryak Valley far behind. Inside the dark belly of the Chinook, bathed in the eerie glow of red tactical lights, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The adrenaline of the firefight was evaporating, replaced by the crushing reality of their wounded teammate. Serena was no longer the phantom sniper of the ridge. She was instantly back in her element. She moved with ruthless efficiency, her hands a blur over Kessler's motionless body. She hung a bag of O-negative whole blood from the canvas troop seats, securing the IV line into his uninjured left arm. "Vitals are crashing. His pressure is dropping to 60/40, Serena shouted over the deafening roar of the engines, pressing her stethoscope against Kessler's chest. "The chest seal is holding, but he's lost too much volume. Sully, squeeze that blood bag. Force it in." Bickford stumbled over to the litter, bracing himself against the bulkhead. He looked down at his bleeding sniper, then grabbed Sullivan's shoulder. "Sully!" Bickford yelled, his voice thick with relief and exhaustion. "I don't know how Tommy made those shots after taking shrapnel, but he saved our lives down there. That 900-yard shot on the DSK gunner? I've never seen anything like it. When he wakes up, you tell him he's getting a silver star." Sullivan didn't look at his commander. He kept his eyes glued to the blood bag in his hands, his face pale under the red lights. He swallowed hard. "Commander," Sullivan started, his voice cracking. He looked across the litter at Serena, who was focused entirely on injecting a syringe of tranexamic acid into Kessler's line to promote clotting. "What is it, Sully?" Bickford demanded. "Tommy didn't take those shots, sir," Sullivan said, his voice barely audible over the turbines. Bickford frowned, leaning closer. "What are you talking about? He's the primary shooter. You told me you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with the Mark 13. "I can't, sir," Sullivan replied, his gaze shifting to the medic. "Tommy was unconscious before the assault team even breached the courtyard. He never fired a shot after the RPG hit." Bickford's brow furrowed in utter confusion. He looked at Sullivan, then at the heavy Mark 13 sniper rifle lying on the floor plates, its barrel still radiating heat. Slowly, Bickford's eyes tracked up to Serena. Her hands were covered in Kessler's blood, her face a mask of absolute professional detachment. "Doc?" Bickford breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You?" Serena didn't look up from her patient. "His pulse is stabilizing. Commander, I need you to step back. Give me room to work." 2 hours later, the Chinook touched down on the tarmac at Bagram Airfield. The medical response team was already waiting. Serena ran alongside the gurney all the way to the surgical doors, barking out drug dosages, mechanism of injury, and blood loss estimates to the trauma surgeons. When the heavy double doors swung shut, she was left standing alone in the stark, fluorescent-lit hallway. She leaned against the concrete wall and slid down to the floor. For the first time all night, her hands began to shake. The debriefing was held at 0400 hours in a windowless plywood hooch on the edge of the Joint Special Operations Command compound. Commander Bickford sat at the head of the metal folding table. Beside him was Captain Richard Mitchell, a severe, by-the-book staff officer from Naval Special Warfare Command who had flown in from Bahrain. Serena sat opposite them, her uniform still stained with dried blood. Sullivan and Cobb sat flanking her, a silent show of solidarity. "Let me make sure I am comprehending this official after-action report, Petty Officer Jenkins," Captain Mitchell said, tapping a pen against a manila folder. "You abandoned your primary medical duties during a mass casualty potential ambush. You took possession of a specialized weapon system you are not qualified to operate, and you proceeded to engage enemy targets at ranges exceeding 800 yards. "I neutralized the threats that were preventing my patient's extraction, sir," Serena said, her voice flat. "If I had remained strictly in a medical posture, Chief Kessler, Commander Bickford, and Petty Officer Cobb would be dead. A medic cannot treat a patient if the patient is blown apart by an RPG." Mitchell bristled. "That is not your call to make. You are not a designated marksman. Do you know what happens when untrained personnel discharge precision ordnance in a chaotic battle space? Collateral damage. Friendly fire. It is a violation of standard operating procedure, and frankly, I am considering recommending non-judicial punishment." The room went dead silent. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Commander Bickford leaned forward, his massive hands resting flat on the table. "With all due respect, Captain, if you try to NJP my medic, you will have a mutiny in Gold Squadron by breakfast." Mitchell glared at him. "David," she fired a .300 Winchester Magnum at a target 950 yards away with shifting canyon winds, without a spotter giving her dope. That is statistically impossible for an untrained shooter. It was reckless luck, and we don't reward recklessness." "It wasn't luck," Serena said quietly. Both officers looked at her. "Excuse me?" Mitchell snapped. Serena sat up straight, her eyes hardening into steel. "My name is Serena Jenkins, but before I was a corpsman, I was the daughter of Master Gunnery Sergeant William Jenkins, USMC. He was the chief instructor at the Scout Sniper School at Quantico. The room remained completely still. Mitchell lowered his pen. I grew up reading Major John Plaster's The Ultimate Sniper instead of fairy tales, Serena continued, her voice steady and unapologetic, referencing the legendary military marksman and author whose doctrines shaped modern sniper tactics. By the time I was 14, I was shooting sub-MOA groupings at 1,000 yards. I spent 3 summers competing at the national matches at Camp Perry, shooting alongside guys from the Army Marksmanship Unit. I didn't join the Navy to be a sniper because, at the time, women weren't allowed to hold the billet. I wanted to save lives, so I became a corpsman. But I know how to read wind mirages, Captain. I know how to calculate spindrift and barometric pressure. I know that Mark 13 rifle better than I know my own heartbeat. She looked directly into Mitchell's eyes. It wasn't luck, sir. It was math. The threat of a court-martial quietly evaporated. Captain Mitchell, recognizing the political and operational nightmare of punishing a female medic who had just flawlessly saved a Tier 1 assault team, decided to bury the details in a highly classified addendum to the mission report. Officially, the devastating sniper fire that night was attributed to Chief Kessler, prior to his injuries. But in the secretive, tightly knit world of naval special warfare, the truth moved like wildfire. 4 weeks later, Serena was sitting in the mess hall at Naval Amphibious Base, Coronado, in California. She was pushing gray eggs around her plate, her mind 1,000 miles away. The transition back to stateside training was always jarring, but the silence from her platoon had been deafening. Since they had returned, the men of Gold Squadron had treated her with a strange, respectful distance. She assumed they were angry. She had broken the unwritten rule. She had stepped out of her lane. In the SEAL teams, trust is currency, and hiding a skill set that lethal was a breach of trust. Mind if I sit down? Serena looked up. Standing over her was Chief Tommy Kessler. His right arm was heavily immobilized in a black custom sling, his shoulder packed with titanium plates and screws from his surgeries at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. He looked paler, thinner, but his eyes were sharp. "Tommy," Serena said, immediately standing up, "you're supposed to be on convalescent leave. What are you doing on base?" "Couldn't stand my living room," Kessler grunted, awkwardly pulling out a chair with his left hand and sitting down. "Plus, I had some unfinished business." Serena slowly sat back down. "Listen, Chief, about what happened in the Shuryak Valley." "Sully told me," Kessler interrupted, his voice low. He wasn't smiling. "He told me you packed my artery while taking incoming fire. He told me you picked up my rifle. He told me you dropped an RPG gunner at 800 and threaded a DSHK gunner through sandbags at 950. Cold bore, no dial-in." Serena swallowed hard. "I did what I had to do to get you out." Kessler stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The mess hall around them faded away. Then he reached into his left pocket with his good hand. He pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of olive drab cloth. He slid it across the table toward her. "I pulled the data off the ballistic software on my scope before I turned the rifle over to the armory," Kessler said softly. "I saw the impact logs. You didn't just save my life, Doc. You outshot me." Serena looked at the cloth on the table. "What is this?" "I'm medically retired, Doc. The nerve damage in my shoulder is permanent. I'll never pull a trigger professionally again," Kessler said, his voice completely void of self-pity, replaced only by a fierce pride. "I spent my whole life mastering that craft. It's an art form, it's a brotherhood, and you proved you belong in it." Serena reached out with trembling fingers and peeled back the olive drab fabric. Resting in the center was a small, subdued metal pin. It was a skull with crosshairs over the eye, the unofficial, highly coveted challenge, coin and insignia of the SEAL sniper community. It was a token earned only through blood, sweat, and confirmed hits. "You don't wear the tab officially," Kessler said, leaning forward. "The Navy might never recognize what you did that night. But the men in that valley? Commander Bickford, Sully, Cobb? We know. You stepped into the breach, Doc. You held the line." Serena stared at the metal pin, her vision suddenly blurring with tears. She furiously blinked away. She had spent her entire military career trying to suppress the lethal skills her father had taught her, trying to balance the scales by healing instead of hurting. She thought the men would reject her for it. Instead, they were embracing her. Kessler stood up, wincing slightly as his shoulder shifted. He looked down at the medic who had given him a second chance at life. "You keep that with you," Kessler said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whenever you doubt yourself, or whenever some desk jockey questions your place in this unit, you remember what you did. We'll never forget." He turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the linoleum floor. Serena sat alone in the mess hall, her hand closing tightly around the cold metal of the sniper pin. She looked out the window toward the Pacific Ocean, the crashing waves mirroring the storm that had finally settled inside her chest. She was Doc Jenkins. She was a healer. But she finally understood that sometimes the only way to save a life was to look through a piece of glass and pull the trigger. Serena Jenkins never officially wore the sniper tab, but in the clandestine halls of naval special warfare, her name became a quiet legend. She proved that when the lines of survival blur, titles vanish, leaving only the warrior beneath. The Shuryak Valley witnessed a medic who healed with her hands and saved with a rifle. To the Men of Gold Squadron, she was their ultimate guardian.